Hey guys, tonight we begin with something deeply fascinating. The state of mental health in medieval times. What did it mean to feel anxious, depressed, or simply off? Well, let's just say therapy wasn't covered by the local guild. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, your mental health, your moods, your energy, your thoughts, your tendency to cry over burnt porridge was believed to be controlled by a stew of internal fluids. These weren't metaphorical. They were literal bodily juices. And yes, someone somewhere probably tried to measure them. Quiet minds and troubled souls. Mental health in medieval Europe. Understanding the medieval mind. You may imagine medieval Europe as a world of castles, plagues, knights, and long-lost kingdoms. But beneath those grand images were ordinary people trying to understand something far more intimate, the workings of their own minds. In a time when language for emotions was limited, where superstition intermingled with faith, and where daily survival was far from guaranteed, mental health occupied an unusual space, both deeply personal and yet interpreted almost entirely by religion, community, and tradition. To understand what mental health meant to a medieval person, you must place yourself in their world. Imagine you are standing in a small village somewhere in 13th century England. The air is cool, and the smell of damp earth drifts upward after morning rain. A few timber houses line a narrow, muddy path. You can hear the faint clatter of a smith's hammer and the soft bleating of sheep in a nearby field. Life here is quiet, slow, and mostly repetitive. But beneath this calm surface, the pressures of survival shape every mind. People in the medieval world did not think of mental health as you do today. They had no psychologists, no diagnostic categories, no scientific framework to understand anxiety, depression, trauma, or even profound grief. Instead, a mixture of religious explanations, humoral theory, and community belief shaped how people understood the human mind. In this world, if you felt sadness that lingered, it might be described as a result of melancholia, caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors. If you experienced overwhelming fear, it could be explained as a disturbance of the soul or even a form of spiritual trial. And if someone behaved erratically, speaking to themselves, lashing out, or withdrawing from others, the community often interpreted it through the lenses they understood best: divine punishment, demonic influence, or perhaps a sign that the person had been touched by forces beyond ordinary understanding. Yet, despite the harshness of medieval interpretations, you might be surprised by how much empathy existed in daily life. While the most dramatic cases of mistreatment appear in historical writing, especially regarding accusations of possession or witchcraft, the truth for many ordinary villages was simpler. People helped their own. If a community member struggled mentally, becoming withdrawn, anxious, or overly fearful, others often stepped in quietly. It wasn't called therapy. It was simply life. A neighbor bringing bread, a priest offering prayer, a friend sitting with someone during a long winter evening. Still, The medieval mind was constantly shaped by the realities of the environment. Darkness fell early, especially in northern regions. Winters were long, cold, and isolating. Fires and candles provided limited light, creating vast stretches of quiet solitude. Travel was dangerous and rare, meaning that many lived their entire lives within the boundaries of the same small village where they were born. Routines were repetitive: tending fields, caring for animals, repairing tools, hauling water. If you were lucky, you shared the work with family or close neighbors. If not, the quiet could grow heavy. The church, omnipresent in medieval life, was the primary interpreter of mental and emotional states. Priests preached about the balance between sin and virtue, about temptations of the mind, and about the necessity of confession. Mental struggles were labeled in spiritual terms: aesthesia, a form of spiritual restlessness often compared to depression; despair, seen as a sin of losing hope; or temptation, which could describe intrusive thoughts, fear, or anxiety. The church did not provide therapy, but it provided structure, a rhythm of prayer, observation, and ritual that many relied on to maintain emotional stability in a world with few other tools. Then there was humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians. Most medieval medical practitioners believed the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Mental states were thought to result from an imbalance among them. Too much black bile caused sadness. Too much blood brought enthusiasm or even rashness. Treatment might involve herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, or, in more extreme cases, bloodletting. Although rudimentary by modern standards, this approach offered a form of structure, something physical to blame, something physical to treat. But the medieval world also included more mysterious interpretations of mental distress. In some regions, especially during periods of intense religious fervor or social strain, unusual behavior could be seen as evidence of demonic possession. These interpretations were not uniform. A person hearing voices or experiencing uncontrollable emotions might be quietly cared for in one village, but declared in need of an exorcism in another. Such differences reflected local culture, the personality of a priest, and even the political tensions of the time. Daily life did little to relieve mental strain. Hard labor began early in childhood. Food insecurity was constant. Illness, injury, and death were familiar companions, and grief was deeply woven into the rhythm of existence. Families often lost children. Communities lost adults to disease and conflict. Such losses shaped emotional life profoundly, yet medieval people rarely spoke about feelings the way you do today. Grief was accepted as a natural part of life, but that acceptance did not eliminate its weight. For those living near monasteries or within them, mental life took on another dimension. Monks and nuns followed strict routines: prayer at fixed hours, silent contemplation, copying manuscripts, and performing chores. These rhythms were meant to provide spiritual discipline, but they also affected mental well-being. For some, the predictable routine offered peace. For others, especially those prone to melancholy, the silence and isolation could deepen emotional discomfort. Monastic leaders occasionally documented such states, describing restlessness, boredom, or despair among monks, what early writers referred to as the noonday demon. It was not treated with therapy but with prayer, repentance, or increased work. Yet even without modern psychology, medieval people developed ways to cope. Herbalists recommended calming plants like chamomile, lavender, and valerian. Families offered support through shared work and communal meals. Storytelling, music, and festivals provided brief relief from the intensity of daily life. Seasonal celebrations, harvest feasts, saints' days, midsummer gatherings, brought moments of joy and connection. These events were more than entertainment. They were emotional resets, offering reassurance that life had meaning beyond toil. When people struggled severely, communities adapted. Some towns allowed those with significant mental impairment to live near churches or monasteries, believing proximity to holiness offered some protection. Others relied on extended family to provide ongoing care. Only in the largest cities did more structured responses appear, such as the founding of hospitals that loosely combined medical care, religious charity, and basic containment. These early institutions were not designed to heal the mind in a modern sense, but they acknowledged that some individuals needed more support than a village could provide. Across centuries, attitudes toward mental health slowly shifted, influenced by outbreaks of disease, changes in religious doctrine, and the gradual spread of medical texts. The Black Death in the mid-14th century, for example, brought widespread trauma. No one understood what caused the disease, and fear spread quickly. The emotional toll on survivors was immense. Some chroniclers wrote of people who withdrew entirely from society, overwhelmed by grief and confusion. Others described a rise in erratic behavior, interpreted as a breakdown of faith or morality. In reality, these were early signs of collective psychological distress. But through all of this, misinterpretations, superstitions, primitive medical practices, you can see something familiar. People trying to make sense of their thoughts, emotions, and fears. Their explanations differ from yours, but their experiences do not. They felt sadness, anxiety, loneliness, confusion, hope, joy, and a longing for comfort, just as you do. As you stand in that medieval village once more, listening to the rustle of wind through thatched roofs and the distant ringing of a church bell, you might wonder, how did ordinary people truly cope with emotional suffering when their world offered so few tools? And what hidden strategies did they rely on that still echoes subtly in your own life today? Daily life, hidden struggles, and medieval coping rituals. If you step deeper into the medieval world, you will begin to see how mental well-being intertwined quietly with the routines, beliefs, and social expectations of everyday life. In this section, you will explore how medieval people navigated emotional challenges within the structure of their daily activities, how they interpreted stress, sadness, grief, and inner conflict, how they coped, and how their methods, though rooted in superstition and limited medical knowledge, often mirrored familiar, human attempts to find stability in an uncertain world. To understand this, imagine waking up as an ordinary villager in the 12th or 13th century. The day begins before sunrise, not because you want to, but because your world revolves around daylight. You share a small house with your family, perhaps several generations of them. Privacy is almost non-existent. You sleep in the same room where you cook, work, and often raise children. Stress is constant, but you do not name it as stress. The word does not exist yet. Instead, you simply rise, prepare yourself for work, and accept that this is life. As you step outside, the morning air carries a cold dampness that seeps through your wool clothing. You hear roosters crowing, animals stirring, and distant voices calling to one another. Your tasks will be the same as yesterday's and the day before. Repetition defines your world. For many, this rhythm offers comfort. Predictability provides a sense of order, especially in a world filled with uncertainties like crop failures, storms, disease, or war. But for others, the monotony can deepen feelings of melancholy or restlessness. Medieval writers rarely describe these internal frustrations, yet their diaries, letters, and sermons hint at quiet emotional struggles beneath the surface. Most medieval people believed the mind could be influenced by external forces. A sudden sense of dread might be interpreted as a sign from God. Persistent sadness could be seen as an imbalance of black bile, a humoral disturbance. If someone experienced anxiety or intrusive thoughts, this might be considered an attack of the devil's temptations. And if someone fell into deep apathy, showing no interest in life or prayer, they could be accused of aesthesia, the spiritual laziness described in monastic texts. But beyond these interpretations, life required coping mechanisms that modern readers might recognize, though often in unfamiliar forms. One of these coping tools was community engagement. In close-knit villages, neighbors relied on each other for survival. This interdependence created a subtle form of emotional support. When a family struggled, others noticed. If someone seemed overwhelmed, it was common for a neighbor to offer small acts of assistance, helping with crops, sharing food, or watching children. These acts were practical, but they also provided emotional relief. Without formal psychology, medieval people leaned on community to ease burdens they did not know how to name. Festivals and feast days also served an important role in maintaining mental stability. The medieval calendar was filled with religious holidays marking saints' days, harvests, births, and commemorations. These events broke the monotony of hard labor. Music, dancing, shared meals, and storytelling created moments of joy and connection. For individuals struggling with sadness or isolation, these gatherings offered reminders that life extended beyond toil and inner turmoil. The Church may have framed these events as spiritual observances, but they functioned equally as emotional resets. Abundant evidence shows that medieval storytelling played a quiet but powerful role in shaping mental resilience. Whether gathered around fires or listening to traveling performers in market squares, people found comfort in tales shared from memory. Stories explained moral dilemmas, offered warnings, passed down history, or simply entertained. But they also provided emotional insight. Many medieval stories addressed themes of loss, betrayal, longing, or spiritual struggle, issues audiences recognized intimately. By listening, people found that their own feelings were not unique. In a world with no written self-help guides, storytelling was a communal form of therapy. Music, too, offered solace. From peasants humming while working to monks chanting in monasteries, melodies filled the medieval soundscape. Chanting provided rhythmic structure that calmed the mind. Village musicians played simple instruments, flutes, lyres, hand drums, and created tones that, though limited compared to modern complexity, carried emotional weight. Music softened the edges of loneliness. It offered comfort during long winter nights and brought a sense of unity during gatherings. But perhaps the most significant influence on medieval mental health was the church. Religion permeated every aspect of life. People prayed when they woke, prayed before meals, prayed before sleep, and prayed whenever trouble arose. Confession provided a rare opportunity to speak openly about personal struggles, even if the language used was spiritual rather than emotional. A medieval villager might confess fear, jealousy, despair, or guilt, describing feelings that today might be diagnosed as anxiety or depression. The priest would listen, offer guidance, assign penance, and encourage prayer. While not therapy in the modern sense, confession offered something undeniably therapeutic, the chance to be heard. Beyond confession, the church offered rituals that brought comfort. Lighting candles, reciting familiar prayers, attending Mass, and participating in processions gave people a sense of structure. Ritual provided predictability in a world that lacked it elsewhere. Even for those struggling emotionally, the rhythms of religious life added stability that might have otherwise been absent. Herbal remedies formed another layer of coping. Medieval herbalists, often women, possessed extensive knowledge passed down through generations. Chamomile, lavender, mint, valerian, rosemary, and lemon balm were commonly used to soothe the mind. These herbs appeared in simple teas, poultices, or fragrant bundles hung in sleeping quarters. Although medieval healers did not speak in the language of neurotransmitters or anxiety reduction, they observed that certain plants calmed troubled minds. Their remedies were practical, affordable, and accessible to most villagers. Alongside herbs, simple physical remedies were used. Warm baths, though not daily, were believed to restore balance. Massaging stiff muscles, resting near hearths, or taking walks by rivers were considered acts of physical cleansing and mental renewal. In monastic communities, meditation-like practices appeared, though framed through prayer rather than secular mindfulness. Monks sat in silence, focusing on breath and contemplation. This was meant to deepen spiritual understanding, but it also provided a form of mental self-regulation. Still, for some individuals, emotional struggles took forms that communities found difficult to understand. Those who behaved unpredictably, shouting, withdrawing entirely, or wandering aimlessly, were often labeled as touched by forces beyond the natural world. Yet in many villages, these people were not mistreated. They were fed, housed, and watched over. Communities recognized the fragility of the human mind even without understanding its mechanisms. Families took responsibility for their own members. Neighbors offered help where they could. Only in larger towns did more severe or disruptive behaviors result in confinement or institutional care. Interestingly, in many medieval writings, you can find references to people experiencing what modern psychology might classify as burnout. Chronic overwork, especially during intense agricultural seasons, pushed individuals to exhaustion. Symptoms described by chroniclers, fatigue, irritability, hopelessness, mirror modern descriptions of emotional burnout. Medieval interpretations framed this as imbalance, temptation, or spiritual trial, but the experience itself remains familiar. Marriage and family life also shaped emotional well-being. Some medieval marriages were affectionate. Others were marked by strain or necessity. Emotional frustrations could result from lack of compatibility, financial hardship, or illness within the family. In a world where divorce was nearly impossible and where extended families often lived together in cramped spaces, unresolved tension was common. Yet families developed internal strategies, shared responsibilities, elders mediating disputes, or community involvement when conflicts escalated. Children faced their own emotional challenges. Many grew up under strict discipline, working from a very young age. Emotional expression was rarely encouraged. Yet they found comfort in games, songs, friendships, and seasonal festivals. Childhood grief, especially after the death of siblings or parents, left lasting impact. Medieval writings record children who became quiet, withdrawn, or fearful after loss. Early descriptions of childhood trauma. The medieval world may seem distant, yet its emotional landscape reveals a profound truth. People then were not so different from you. They wrestled with stress, grief, sadness, longing, loneliness, fear, and confusion. They sought comfort in community, ritual, work, nature, and moments of joy. Their interpretations were framed by their time, but their experiences were deeply human. As you imagine returning to that medieval village, consider the invisible emotional struggles that shaped its people. The woman carrying water from the well with a weary expression may have been mourning a lost child. The man repairing tools near the blacksmith's hut might be wrestling with anxiety about the next harvest. The monk walking silently beneath the cold stone arches of an abbey could be battling the noonday demon, resisting a wave of spiritual despair. These were not dramatized experiences, just quiet, unspoken realities woven into the texture of everyday life. And as you consider how medieval people coped with emotional hardships through rituals, community, and practical remedies, a question begins to surface. How did these ancient coping methods shape the evolution of mental health care? And which forgotten practices might still hold quiet value for you today? Resolution, transformation, and the medieval legacy of mental well-being. As you continue your journey through the emotional landscape of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that mental health in this era was not defined by clinical terms, diagnostic manuals, or scientific research. Instead, it was shaped by experiences, quiet, persistent, deeply human experiences that unfolded slowly through daily life. In this final section of Story 1, you will explore how medieval ideas about the mind continued to shift over centuries, how these early understandings quietly influenced the future of mental health care, and what lessons from this distant past still echo in your modern world. To begin, imagine yourself walking through a medieval town in the 14th century. Unlike the small rural village of earlier times, this town is larger, busier, and noisier. Merchants call out prices in the marketplace. The smell of bread drifts from a nearby bakery. Children chase one another between narrow, timbered houses. At first glance, life seems full and active. But beneath the liveliness lies a truth unchanged from the countryside. People here, too, face emotional burdens they cannot name. The medieval town is a crossroads of cultures, ideas, and information. Travelers bring news from distant lands. Scholars gather in early universities to debate philosophy and natural science. Physicians trained in Arabic and Greek medical texts begin to circulate new ideas about the human body and mind. With each generation, knowledge expands. And yet, even as new theories emerge, the medieval understanding of mental well-being remains deeply rooted in tradition. Humoral theory still dominates medical practice. The idea that the mind's condition results from bodily imbalance remains persuasive, even comforting. It offers a simple explanation for complex feelings. A man suffering from prolonged sadness might be diagnosed with excessive black bile. A woman prone to sudden fear or panic might be said to have too much phlegm. Treatments, herbs, baths, diets, even controlled bloodletting remain common. But as cities grow, these treatments evolve. Early hospitals appear, often funded by religious institutions, offering beds to the physically ill, the poor, and sometimes those with mental disturbances. These medieval hospitals are not designed like modern facilities. They are more like large communal halls with rows of simple beds. Care is provided not by doctors, but by monks, nuns, or charitable lay workers. Their primary tools are prayer, rest, warmth, and nourishment. While these methods lack scientific grounding, they embody compassion at a time when few understood the mind's complexity. Emotional care is intertwined with physical care, rooted in the belief that the soul and body cannot be separated. Meanwhile, in monasteries and convents, monks and nuns continue to struggle quietly with their own mental well-being. The rigid routine that defines monastic life offers structure and stability, yet it can also produce feelings of restlessness, doubt, or spiritual dryness. Medieval writings record monks who wake in the middle of the night feeling overwhelmed by fear or loneliness. They describe nuns who experience profound grief after the death of a sister in their community. These texts reveal emotional fragility that contradicts the stereotype of monastic stoicism. The Church responds to these struggles through spiritual frameworks. A monk suffering from persistent sadness might be encouraged to confess more often, to engage in manual labor, or to immerse himself in Scripture. But over time, Church leaders begin to recognize that emotional suffering cannot always be reduced to sin or laziness. Some monastic writings suggest an early form of empathy, a willingness to acknowledge that emotional distress is part of the human condition. Although medieval theology does not embrace psychology, it does begin to accept the idea that the mind has its own natural rhythms. Outside monastic walls, everyday people continue to cope with emotional distress through community support. Villages remain tight-knit. Families rely on one another. Neighbors share burdens. And slowly, over centuries, the idea grows that emotional well-being is tied not only to divine influence, but also to earthly factors, diet, environment, work, relationships, and even the changing of seasons. Though medieval people do not use the word mental health, they begin to observe patterns. Sadness deepens in winter, anxiety rises during harvest, joy accompanies festivals, and grief leads to long periods of silence. These observations form the earliest foundations of naturalistic thinking about the mind. Small steps toward understanding the connection between environment and emotion. Then comes one of the most transformative events in medieval history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, plague sweeps across Europe, killing millions and shattering social structures. The psychological impact is immense. Chroniclers describe widespread fear, despair, and hopelessness. Some people retreat into silence. Others turn to religious extremism. Many experience survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived while their families perished. Entire villages disappear. Fields remain untilled. Children wander without parents. Grief becomes a collective experience. In this atmosphere of immense trauma, medieval society confronts mental suffering on a scale never before recorded. The Church, overwhelmed by death and unable to explain the plague, loses some of its authority. Communities begin to rely more on local healers, herbalists, and practical coping methods. Though superstition persists, the trauma of the plague slowly nudges medieval Europe toward more human-centered understandings of emotional pain. By the late Middle Ages, early medical writers begin to acknowledge that emotional experiences, especially trauma and grief, leave lasting marks on the mind. They describe melancholic states following major loss. They observe that people who have experienced frightening events may suffer from recurring nightmares, trembling, or sudden fears. These descriptions, though framed in humoral language, reflect early recognition of psychological trauma. Meanwhile, in daily life, medieval people develop quiet strategies to maintain emotional balance. They spend more time in nature, walking through fields or forest edges. They gather in taverns to share stories or news. They craft objects, tools, clothing, baskets, finding calm in repetitive movement. They tend gardens, observing the slow growth of herbs and vegetables. They care for animals whose behavior provides comfort and companionship. These small routines become anchors in a world of uncertainty. Over centuries, the connection between environment and mental state becomes increasingly apparent. Some medieval physicians begin recommending lifestyle changes rather than invasive treatments. They advise spending time outdoors, avoiding isolation, eating balanced meals, and engaging in social gatherings. Though primitive, these recommendations form the early seeds of holistic approaches to mental well-being. As knowledge expands, medieval Europe begins to slowly transition toward the early Renaissance. New ideas spread through trade routes, translated manuscripts, and contact with scholars in the Islamic world. Medicine becomes more organized, though still limited. Philosophers debate the nature of the mind, the soul, and human emotion. Gradually, explanations shift from purely spiritual to partially naturalistic. Emotional struggles begin to be seen not as divine punishment, but as part of human experience. By the end of the medieval period, mental health is no longer framed entirely by superstition or religious interpretation. The groundwork for future advancements has been laid. Humoral theory persists, but its dominance weakens. Herbal traditions evolve. Community care remains central. Early hospitals become more structured. And through it all, a quiet truth emerges. Medieval people recognized the importance of mental well-being even if they lacked the words to define it. As you reflect on this long journey through the medieval mind, you may notice echoes of your own world. The desire for stability, connection, comfort, and understanding remains the same. Medieval people sought meaning in rituals, community in gatherings, relief in nature, and solace in storytelling, much like you do today. Their coping strategies, though ancient, mirror timeless human needs. The final question, then, is what all this means for you. What do the emotional struggles of medieval people teach you about your own mental landscape? Perhaps they remind you that uncertainty has always been part of human life, that grief and fear are ancient companions, that communities, rituals, nature, and simple routines offer grounding even when tools are limited. That emotional suffering is not a sign of weakness, but a shared human experience stretching across centuries. As you leave behind the medieval world and step back into your own, you may carry with you a quieter understanding of the people who lived so long ago. Their minds were shaped by their world just as yours is shaped by yours. And yet, across all these centuries, one question persists, unresolved, timeless, and deeply human. How might the forgotten emotional wisdom of the medieval past still influence the way you care for your own mind today? The long echo, how medieval mental life shapes modern understanding. As you reach the final part of this first story, you may find yourself standing at the threshold between worlds, the distant medieval past, and the complexities of your present life. This section explores how medieval understandings of the mind, limited though they were, formed the quiet foundations of today's approaches to mental health. To connect these worlds, imagine yourself once again walking through a familiar medieval village at dusk. The smell of hearth smoke lingers in the air. Sheep settle into their pens. Families gather inside wooden homes as candlelight flickers gently through cracks in the shutters. At first glance, nothing about this place seems related to modern psychology. Yet, if you look more carefully, you begin to recognize patterns. Early versions of ideas that would eventually evolve into structured theories, therapies, and scientific research. To understand this transition, begin with observational wisdom. Medieval people observed the mind closely, not in medical terms, but through lived experience. They noticed that sadness deepened during long winters. They saw how the loss of a loved one could quiet a person for months or years. They recognized that isolation made people fearful. They understood that community, sunlight, laughter, and shared work lifted spirits. These small observations formed the earliest building blocks of environmental psychology centuries before the term existed. Though their explanations were wrapped in humoral language or religious symbolism, the underlying insight was accurate. The environment affects the mind. Modern psychology, with its studies on seasonal affective disorder, social support networks, and environmental stressors, continues to validate these early intuitions. Another profound contribution of the medieval world is its emphasis on daily rhythm. The structured routines of monastic life, prayer, work, rest, and reflection created predictable days that supported emotional stability. Though monastic schedules were strict, they provided a sense of order that many found comforting. Today, mental health professionals emphasize the importance of daily structure. Regular sleep, meals, exercise, and mindful breaks. Medieval monks practiced these ideas for centuries without scientific justification, relying instead on tradition and spiritual discipline. Their experiences highlight the universal human need for rhythm, predictability, and moments of calm. You may also recognize the medieval origins of mindfulness, though they used different words. Monks practiced contemplative prayer, focusing on breath, silence, and a single repeated phrase. Unlike the modern mindfulness movement, theirs was rooted in spiritual devotion, yet the effect on the mind was similar: reduced tension, deeper focus, and a calmer emotional state. The medieval world also contributed significantly through its community-based approach to mental well-being. Villages took responsibility for their own members. Emotionally distressed individuals were often integrated into daily life rather than isolated from it. Families quietly cared for relatives struggling with sadness, confusion, or unusual behavior. This informal support system formed the earliest version of community mental health care, a concept that remains central today. Modern mental health models frequently highlight the importance of social connection. Loneliness, now studied extensively, is recognized as a major risk factor for emotional distress. The medieval world understood this intuitively. People lived in close proximity, shared meals, worked together, and relied on one another for survival. This interdependent lifestyle offered emotional protection, even without scientific understanding. Religious practices in medieval Europe also shaped the development of therapeutic methods. Confession, for example, contained elements familiar in modern talk therapy. The act of speaking openly about fears, guilt, or internal conflict to a non-judgmental listener created emotional relief. Though framed as a spiritual requirement, confession was often the only space where individuals could express personal struggles. The priest's role, similar in some ways to a counselor, provided guidance, reassurance, and a sense of moral clarity. Over the centuries, this practice contributed indirectly to the development of structured therapeutic dialogue. In addition to confession, rituals played a psychological role. Lighting candles for the dead, participating in community processions, visiting shrines, and performing acts of charity offered symbolic ways to express grief, hope, or gratitude. Modern therapy recognizes the value of rituals in processing emotions, whether through memorial ceremonies, symbolic acts, or structured exercises designed to help individuals navigate loss and transformation. Medieval rituals, though rooted in spiritual belief, fulfilled similar emotional needs. Another surprising legacy comes from herbal traditions. Plants like valerian, chamomile, lavender, and mint were widely used for calming the mind. Medieval herbalists did not know the chemical properties of these plants, yet they observed their effects. These remedies eventually influenced early pharmacology. Today, modern medicine continues to study plant-based compounds for their therapeutic potential. The medieval reliance on herbs reflects a broader human instinct to seek comfort from nature, a relationship that persists, particularly in modern approaches that emphasize holistic well-being. As centuries passed, the medieval understanding of mental health slowly transformed. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in anatomy, science, and empirical observation. Physicians increasingly questioned humoral theory. Scholars translated ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical texts, sparking curiosity about the biological foundations of the mind. Universities expanded medical training, adding anatomy lessons and early psychological concepts. Though progress remained slow, medieval frameworks provided the cultural and intellectual soil where new ideas could take root. By the early modern period, the first specialized institutions for mental illnesses began to appear. Though many of these early asylums had poor conditions, they represented a shift toward recognizing mental illness as something distinct from spiritual or moral failure. The seeds of this shift, however, lived in medieval traditions: compassionate care in monasteries, herbal remedies, community support systems, and early hospital models. In the broader sense, the medieval world teaches a valuable lesson. Mental health is inseparable from culture. People interpret emotions based on their worldviews. Medieval people leaned on faith, nature, community, and routine because those were the frameworks available to them. Their strategies may appear simplistic now, yet they reveal a deep understanding of human needs: connection, meaning, stability, and comfort. These needs remain unchanged in your era. You may also find it meaningful to consider how medieval emotional life reflects your own challenges. Modern life is faster, louder, and more complex. Yet moments of stillness, walking through nature, sharing meals, listening to stories, tending to simple tasks, remain vital for mental equilibrium. Medieval villagers embraced these moments not as therapy, but as life. Their slow rhythms and repetitive tasks, often dismissed as boring, nurtured emotional resilience. The modern world often emphasizes achievement, constant productivity, and rapid communication. Medieval life, by contrast, moved at the pace of seasons, daylight, and manual labor. This pace, though difficult in many ways, offered time for the mind to settle. In this sense, the medieval world provides a quiet reminder: slowness is not a flaw. It is often where healing begins. In returning to the medieval village one last time, imagine fading candlelight inside a small wooden home. A family settles together on straw bedding. The village is silent except for the gentle creaking of wood and the distant bark of a dog. Outside, stars scatter across the night sky, unchanged across centuries. The people inside this house do not know the words mental health, yet they experience the same emotional currents that shape your life. They struggle, they cope, they adapt, and they endure. Their world may seem simpler, but their emotional resilience is deeply familiar. Everything they learned, through observation, ritual, community, and daily rhythm, flows quietly into the future, influencing how humans understand themselves today. And so, as you close this story, one final question lingers, echoing across centuries. If medieval people could find ways to care for their minds in a world filled with hardship and uncertainty, what forgotten wisdom from their quiet lives might help guide your own journey toward balance and peace today?